Okay, so first off, this wine it's called Lyric, but it's a blend. It's a blend of Chenin Blanc, it's a blend of Sauvignon Blanc, and it has a touch of Chardonnay in there. I'd really like to focus on the grape variety Chenin Blanc, which Afrikaners often call Steen, and you sometimes see on the label. This wine also comes from the coastal region here, and as I said in the intro, the coastal region is rather amorphous, but you can get a lot of wine out of that region. Okay, let's go and think a little bit about Steen and how it works in South Africa, and let's go back to the history of South Africa. In 1918, South Africa, the government, established KWV. KWV was a growers cooperative, and it was a highly influential growers cooperative because they were given exclusive, almost exclusive rights to planting, to crop densities, to harvesting, and to winemaking. This is a very, very serious thing for them, and it meant that they essentially were a monopoly over South Africa's winemaking practices. Now, why did that occur in 1918? Because it was the crisis of the loss of trade in the 1860s and the crisis of phylloxera that hit in the 1880s. So KWV led the charge of replanting phylloxera-resistant varieties, and they monopolized the industry by 1918. Now, when they led that charge to monopolize and when they led the charge to replant, what they were looking for is to replant with very high density, with vines that could produce at very high levels, not necessarily high density. Why were they doing this? Because they were a growers cooperative, and they were ensured by the government that whatever they produced, the government would buy. So there was no stipulation about quality in that equation. It was simply however much tonnage you produced as a grower cooperative, the government was going to buy. Okay, what does this mean? It means that there are massive plantings of grape varieties across South Africa, or across the Cape, I should say, where the bulk of the industry is. It also means that there were massive plantings of grape varieties that could crop very heavy, meaning you got a high tonnage load, and also in specific areas take an exceptional amount of heat. Now, with cropping very heavily in areas that weren't hot or that were, of course, the main grape variety that came to dominate in the white wine world was Chenin Blanc. The reason? For those two. It can take a lot of heat, so if you plant it in the Klein Karoo or you plant it in the river valley, it can crop heavy and still be viable as a wine. If you want to plant it in the cool coastal region or the Oliphant River, it can take that and again, crop very heavily. I apologize for saying crop very heavily so much, but this was really the driving factor for them. Now the question is, where did all of that production go? Once this started in 1918, what happened to it all? Well, one amazing historical fact is that the KWV retained all of those responsibilities until 1992. And it wasn't until 1998 that the KWV had relinquished most of them. One factor there is that for almost a century, South Africa's wine production was oriented towards bulk. The other factor was, where was the market for all of this wine? Well, the KWV was clever, and they actually established a series of monstrous distilleries. And in fact, they provided almost all of the brandy consumed in all of Africa for that century. So this bulk of wine production was being made simply to just end up being distilled and put into bottles as brandy and sold that way. A little bit of a tragedy for South Africa, and I think also gives rise to the idea that the Oxford Companion said that the next 100 years that followed, or the next 200 years or 100 years that followed, was somewhat disappointing in terms of their wine. Okay, let's link that history to this wine. I should say, even though it's cheap, and even though I just gave that introduction to it, making it sound like a bulk mass-produced wine, I'd like to convert that around for you and say that I actually like this wine, and I think it drinks really good. And in fact, I think it's a really great representation of Chenin from South Africa and Sauvignon Blanc from South Africa. The other thing I'd like to point out to maybe link all of this together is that you can often find, and this is an example, incredibly priced South African Steen, South African Chenin Blanc. Why can you find it so cheap these days? Well, it's for those reasons that happened a century ago. All of those massive plantings of Chenin Blanc didn't go away. Most of the vineyards are still there. Most of the cost of making wine is actually buying land and planting vineyards. So if the fruit is already planted, if the vineyards are already planted, the vineyard's going to make fruit. If you simply go and harvest it, you can crush wine. And in fact, I think it's now, because of the low vigor of the soils and the age of the vines, you get remarkable wine that is really quite inexpensive. Nederburg happens to be our example today, but you can shop our shelves and you'll see examples of inexpensive South African Chenin that I think are wonderful. Now here, to this one, I think it's really enchanting because South African Chenin cropped at this level, I think, gives you a bright green fruit character to it, and I think this shows it off. But on the palate, I think you also get a nice richness, just a touch of cream, and again, I think that comes from the Chenin Blanc. South African Sauvignon Blanc to me is always an interesting one because it seems to me to fit between the spheres of New Zealand, where many vintners from South Africa choose to go and intern, with its more grapefruit characteristics and brighter gooseberry, but then Sancerre in France with its more flint characteristics, its more stoniness. It's an interesting one, I would say, as a summary, because to me it comes across as maybe an old world Sauvignon Blanc style inflected with just a touch of extra New World fruit to it. And I think you can find very fascinating examples of just solo South African Sauvignon Blancs to it. Here in this Nederburg, you get the combination of the Chenin Blanc characters and the Sauvignon Blanc characters together, giving you a wonderful wine that, even more enjoyably, is at an incredible price.